At 95 years old, Clint Eastwood finally said what he had kept to himself for decades, not in anger, not in bitterness, but with a quiet honesty that stunned Hollywood. For years, people assumed his distance from Rob Reiner was political, personal, or even petty. Clint Eastwood says it was none of those things. It was something far deeper, a fundamental disagreement about what movies are meant to do. In a rare moment of reflection, Eastwood admitted that he watched Hollywood change in a way that made him step back. Stories stopped asking questions. They started delivering answers, and Rob Reiner, whether intentionally or not, became a symbol of that shift. This is not a feud, it's a confession. And what Clint Eastwood revealed raises an uncomfortable question. Has Hollywood forgotten how to let audiences think for themselves? Clint Eastwood was never meant to belong to Hollywood as it exists today. He grew up during the Great Depression, moving from place to place, learning early that silence was not weakness, it was survival. While others learned how to impress, Clint learned how to observe. He watched people closely, noticed what they hid rather than what they said. That instinct would later define not only his acting, but his entire philosophy of filmmaking. When Clint first arrived in Hollywood, the system rejected him outright. Studio executives told him he had no screen presence. His voice was wrong, his face was forgettable. Universal dropped him without ceremony, certain he would never lead a film. Clint didn't argue. He didn't campaign for approval. He simply left. That moment shaped him. Instead of bending to the industry, Clint Eastwood built himself outside of it. In Italy, under Sergio Leone, he discovered something Hollywood rarely allowed: ambiguity. His characters spoke little. Their morality was unclear. Audiences were not instructed how to feel. They were trusted to decide for themselves. That belief never left him. When Clint became a director, he carried that same restraint behind the camera. Few takes, minimal explanation, no speeches about meaning. He believed that if a film had to explain itself, it had already failed. His job, as he saw it, was not to guide the audience but to respect them. This is where the quiet distance between Clint Eastwood and Rob Reiner began. Clint admired Reiner's early work. He respected his skill as a storyteller. But as the years passed, Clint noticed something changing in Hollywood, and Reiner came to represent it. Films no longer trusted viewers to wrestle with uncertainty. They told audiences what to think, what to feel, and which side was morally correct. To Clint, this wasn't progress. It was confinement. He didn't call it out publicly. He didn't criticize Rob Reiner by name. He simply stepped back. He made his films quietly, avoiding commentary, avoiding statements, avoiding the noise. But inside, a concern grew that Hollywood had stopped asking questions and started delivering verdicts. And at 95, with nothing left to protect, Clint Eastwood finally admitted what that distance was really about. Not politics, not ego, but a fear that the industry he once loved no longer trusted its own audience. And that fear, he believes, has changed everything. The divide became clearer when Clint Eastwood stepped fully into the director's chair. From the beginning, his approach unsettled Hollywood. He didn't rehearse actors into exhaustion. He didn't explain every emotional beat. He trusted instinct, especially the instinct of the audience. Eastwood believed that the most powerful moments in film were the ones left unresolved, the ones that lingered after the credits rolled because no one had told you what they meant. Films like Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby were not built to comfort viewers. They were built to challenge them. Violence had consequences. Heroes were flawed. Redemption, if it came at all, was incomplete. Clint refused to give speeches through his characters. He let silence do the work. To him, that silence was respect. Around the same time, Clint watched Hollywood drift in the opposite direction. Stories grew louder. Messages grew clearer. Ambiguity was replaced with certainty. Films increasingly arrived with instructions: who was right, who was wrong, and what lesson should be taken home. Rob Reiner, Clint observed, became one of the most visible faces of that transformation. This was not personal animosity. Clint never accused Reiner of lacking talent. In fact, he openly acknowledged the brilliance of Reiner's early films, their warmth, their humanity, their ability to connect. But something had shifted. The stories no longer asked audiences to think. They asked them to agree. For Clint Eastwood, that shift was devastating. He believed that when art becomes a vehicle for certainty, it loses its soul. When filmmakers stopped trusting audiences to wrestle with discomfort, they reduced cinema to persuasion rather than exploration. And persuasion, Clint felt, belonged to politics, not storytelling. The distance between the two men widened, not through arguments, but through absence. They didn't collaborate, they didn't debate publicly. Clint simply chose a different path. He made films that refused to reassure. He avoided interviews that demanded declarations. He stayed silent while others grew louder. By his own admission, Clint didn't feel angry. He felt sad. Sad that Hollywood had become impatient with nuance. Sad that younger filmmakers were afraid to leave questions unanswered. Sad that disagreement itself was beginning to feel unacceptable. In that climate, Rob Reiner's confidence in moral clarity stood in sharp contrast to Clint's belief in moral inquiry. At 95, Clint finally articulated the concern he had carried quietly for decades. "When you stop letting people think," he said, "you stop treating them like adults." It was not an attack, it was a warning. A warning that cinema, at its best, does not tell us who to be, it shows us who we are, and lets us decide what to do with that knowledge. And as Clint looked at the industry he helped build, he wondered whether that kind of storytelling was becoming endangered not because it failed, but because it no longer fit an age that demanded answers instead of questions. What Clint Eastwood feared most was not disagreement, it was conformity. As Hollywood grew more polarized, Clint watched a subtle shift take place not just in films, but in the people making them. Directors began to speak less about curiosity and more about certainty. Stories were no longer invitations to reflect, they were declarations meant to be endorsed. And dissent, even quiet dissent, started to feel risky. In that environment, Clint saw something troubling happen to younger filmmakers. They stopped asking, "What if I'm wrong?" and started asking, "Will this be accepted?" The space for ambiguity shrank. Silence was misread as avoidance. Nuance was mistaken for weakness. Clint never believed that artists should hide their beliefs, but he believed just as strongly that art should never close a conversation before it begins. To him, the role of cinema was not to settle arguments, but to open them to let audiences sit with discomfort and discover their own conclusions. This is where his quiet unease with Rob Reiner became impossible to ignore. Reiner's confidence in moral clarity was admired by many. Clint understood why. In uncertain times, people crave firm answers, but Clint worried that certainty, when woven too tightly into storytelling, leaves no room for doubt. And doubt, he believed, is where empathy lives. He didn't argue this publicly. He didn't debate Reiner on panels or stages. Clint chose the only response that felt honest to him: distance. He kept making films that resisted explanation. He allowed characters to contradict themselves. He trusted viewers to wrestle with meaning rather than receive it prepackaged. At 95, Clint Eastwood finally admitted that this distance wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Because in a world demanding allegiance, Clint chose something quieter, the stubborn belief that audiences deserve questions, not instructions. And that once art stops trusting people to think, it stops being art at all. In the end, Clint Eastwood made it clear that his words were never meant to single out Rob Reiner as a villain. He spoke with restraint, even respect. What troubled him was not one man's choices, but what those choices symbolized in a broader cultural shift. To Clint, Rob Reiner represented a generation of filmmakers who believed cinema should guide society toward the right conclusions. Clint, shaped by a harsher century, believed the opposite, that art should reflect human complexity without resolving it. One side trusted certainty, the other trusted doubt. That difference explains decades of distance more than any rumor or political label ever could. Clint didn't walk away from Hollywood because he was pushed out. He stepped back because he no longer recognized the conversation. The industry that once celebrated outsiders, ambiguity, and moral tension now seemed uncomfortable with unanswered questions. At 95, Clint Eastwood wasn't asking Hollywood to change. He knew that era had passed. What he offered instead was a final reminder that the most enduring stories are not the ones that tell us what to believe, but the ones that trust us enough to decide for ourselves. And in that quiet admission lies the true weight of what he finally chose to say. Clint Eastwood's words were never meant to end a debate. They were meant to remind us why debate matters. At 95, he wasn't defending the past or attacking the present. He was asking whether storytelling still trusts its audience or simply instructs it, whether cinema still leaves room for doubt, silence, and personal judgment. If this story made you reflect on how movies and culture have changed, share your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video if you believe great stories should ask questions, not give orders. And subscribe to the channel for more untold reflections from Hollywood's last witnesses, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the longest echoes.